few months ago, we expanded our terms of reference to include not just the health aspect of coronavirus, but also to look at the wealth aspect of coronavirus. We are all aware of the fact that there are many people who suffered financially and lost a lot during this time. We're also very aware, perhaps the last couple of weeks more than ever, that there were also others who gained. And we wanted to have a panel and a session that would look at both sides of that coin. And so I'm really delighted to have been able to pull that together for everyone today. So the first session, which will last 45 minutes, we're going to hear from people who have themselves been personally financially impacted by the pandemic. And in the second session, we're going to talk to trade bodies, organizations who perhaps can help shed some light on some of the procurement issues that have come to the fore literally over the last few weeks, but well before that as well. So if I can just quickly introduce and then ask them to tell us their story. We have Pauline Isherwood, Anita Mandel, and Keith Webb. And I wonder, starting with Pauline, then to Anita, and then to Keith, could you take us through how you were impacted back in March 2020, and how were you supported by the government? Pauline?
Thanks very much. Thanks for having us today. So I'm Pauline Isherwood. So I started my sole trader business in April 2018. And prior to that, I worked in Shell in the leadership development space. So I'm a freelance facilitator. So I help people with leadership development. I specialise in diversity and inclusion. So the pandemic hit, and the Chancellor stood at the podium and said, no one will be left behind. And then he said, well, actually 5% will be left behind. And I sat there and laughed and went, that'll be those people that have those sunbed shops and those cash businesses that don't declare their tax, and they don't deserve to get help. Little did I know that actually there was going to be more people that were not helped than actually were helped with self-employment, because of the criteria for the self-employment income support, which was not applied to furlough, but for some reason it was applied to SEIS. I also volunteer for the excluded organisation. I was their events manager when we were really up to speed. So I know quite a lot about this space, and I've watched far more politics than what was ever good for me. I'd like to go back to my little bubble before 2019, when I was oblivious to the House of Parliament and the shenanigans that go on, etc. So your question then, so what happened was, the pandemic hit. I had a busy diary. I did a lot of global travel. The pandemic hit and my busy diary emptied. So how that year bore out for me, 70% down on what I'd done 2018 and 19. And the reason I never got financial support from the government was because of a redundancy payment from Shell, which meant I was then in the biggest bracket, which was the 50-50 criteria. So this was a one-off redundancy payment. I was 100% self-employed. I didn't have a second job. I couldn't go furlough on the PIW part because redundancy means you're no longer employed. And other people, they were impacted by drawdowns of pensions, or if they were in receipt. We've got one lady in the group who received she's a veteran, she received a small army pension. And that put her over the 50%. It was just bizarre. Another beautician lady, a bereavement payment put her over. So that's what these policies, in fact, actually done. Other categories, of course, were limited company directors, and other categories were those that earned more than 50,000. Of course, when you look at furlough, you were allowed to earn whatever, and you just get the ceiling limit. So why was that not applied to the SICE scheme? So that's what happened then. So 70% down. I had to, use my savings. So the month before the pandemic, I was living life large in Las Vegas with my family. I had a very nice life, didn't have any debt. Bring on the pandemic, and you're using your savings to pay your bills. So it was a really tough year. I've never experienced that before. And I've never been political, but I couldn't believe that we were just getting ignored. And we had a massive amount of support in the House of Commons, with the APPG caps and support. We were regularly on it, getting mentioned all the time. House of Commons, House of Lords, the excluded group were coming up constantly. And the pantomime that is just, they used to just read the script of all the support that were given other people that not us. That's not helpful. And I understand the reasons why. Yes, they were, had to put in schemes quickly, but when you realise you've done so much wrong, listen and try and fix it. They just never wanted to fix it, which again didn't seem compatible with all of the U-turns that was happening. And just to add, by the way, I voted for Conservative, so full on me. I'm a swing voter, but yeah. So yeah, so that's what happened to me.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your story. It doesn't get easier to share, I'm no doubt about it. Anita and then Keith, what happened to you?
So my name's Anita. Thanks for having me this morning. So I run a travel company, home-based. I set up my company back in 2014. Before that, I worked as a tour guide, taking groups around the world, everywhere. And I followed my dream, set up my own company, and was doing pretty well. I was advised that my company should be a limited company for several reasons. So I set up a limited company, and in March 2020, well, February, I could see things weren't going to go to plan for me. And I built up, it takes a while to build up a company, I realized, to build up my business, and I was doing really well. So obviously coronavirus struck, and I had to not only stop trading, I couldn't do any business, but the other thing I had to do was refund. Refund. I had so many bookings for 2020, 2021 even. And so all I had to do then was give people their money back. So all the hard work I'd done in the months previous to the pandemic was undone also. And yeah, I've done everything by the book. That's the type of person I am. And so I even had to start refunding money I hadn't got back myself, because the rule is I had to do it within 2 weeks. A lot of my clients said, "Oh, just give me the money back when you've got it," but some I had to. So not only did I not have any business, my business went down to zero. I was giving money back. And the same as Pauline, when Rishi made his speech, I thought, "Oh, I'll be okay. I'll survive this." But then I realized I couldn't get any support, because the way I did my business was that I didn't set up a pay-as-you-earn for myself. Because I don't know, maybe I was a bit naive, because I'd always been self-employed. And so what I did was I used to just pay when things were looking good, because say someone pays for a trip in September for the next August, I don't see the profit until after the trip has happened. So you never really know. So when things were good, I'd just pay myself a lump sum, and then I would put that on my self-assessment, because I always filled out a self-assessment. And everyone says, "Oh, the limited company directors, you tax dodgers, you pay yourselves in dividends." I actually didn't. I did maybe 2,000 a year in dividends, if that. I didn't really understand that I could do that even until my accountant told me, because I was naive. I just wanted to run my business and have happy clients and make a living. So anyway, the thing is, so I couldn't get anything for my company because I was home-based. I'm a limited company director. Couldn't furlough myself, because I had to work at giving all the refunds. And then the other thing was that because I used to work as a tour guide on a freelancer, as I was building my business up to keep my income coming in, I used to work for a company to do some tours for them as a tour guide. So I'd take a contract, say, for 10 days, and that was on pay as you earn. It wasn't, they'd put me on the payroll because HMRC had said they had to do that, because a lot of travel companies have been under investigation by early 2000s. So they would put me on the payroll. So I was a pay-as-you-earn freelancer in tandem with running my business while I built it up, because it was good income, it was good money. So I'd take maybe 4 10-day contracts in a year, and that outweighed what I put in from the company in the first couple, the earlier years. And so I lost out from being a limited company director. I lost out because I was a pay-as-you-earn freelancer, so I couldn't get anything for that. and I lost out on the 50-50 rule. So I got a real hat trick, you know. It was just, and you know, I just kept thinking, well, they'll do something, surely. I couldn't even get universal credit because I had savings. So I had the savings, I got my own house, looked after my money. So I couldn't even get that because it was means tested. And then I saw all the people who were getting furlough, and I'm thinking, well, that's not means tested. How can a couple in a household be getting that money? And they've got savings. And so I've had zero income for 2 years now because travel is only just really getting back on its feet. I've had nothing. So, and I used to travel to India. I used to travel to Asia and third world countries. And I'd say to my clients, oh, in this country, if you don't work, you don't get any money. Thank God we live in a country where that wouldn't happen. Well, 2 years of no income. And I've paid my tax, I've paid my income tax, I've paid my corporation tax. I've done everything by the book, and I didn't get any help. And you know, I've had to kind of switch it off now because I've had to move on, and I'm not an angry and bitter person. So I've moved on, I've written a book, I've done all sorts to try and diversify. But for the travel business, so I was only just sort of recovering now because of the niche that I have. If you're small, you have to have a niche. So I'm having to diversify. And I've tried, but as I say, people have kind of lost confidence in travel. So it's been really hard, and I've realised how resilient I am through this. But basically, I haven't earned a penny in 2 years. So that's my story.
Thank you for sharing, Anita. We'll dive into the sort of what now a bit later on. But if I can come to you, Keith, what's your story? If I can also, dare say, ask a little, we need a bit more brevity, otherwise we're going to eat up all the time. Although the stories are really important. I do appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. I'm not known for my brevity, but I'll try. Spent a lot of time on the APPG gaps in support, as Pauline mentioned. Well versed in this. I was part of the strategy team for the Forgotten Limited campaign. So I heard a lot worse stories than I'm going to tell you now, which is my story, but nevertheless it informs the panel. Good. I'm a business consultant. I work with startups, small businesses, micro businesses. The failure rate of small businesses in the UK is around about 60% don't make it to the 3rd anniversary. 85% of new businesses don't make it to their 5th birthday. So consequently, there's a huge need for help for small businesses, and I do that. I'm an experienced business person, so I go into small businesses and I help them try and survive, and I've done it for 8 years now. So that's what I do. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was advised that I was clinically extremely vulnerable, and so I had to shield. So I was told by the government, you can't go out. So as I have to go out to work, at that moment in time, the 3 contracts I had going stopped overnight because I couldn't go out and work. And a bit like Pauline, I thought, and no doubt Anita as well, I thought, well, help will come because Rishi has said no one will be abandoned, no one will be left behind, nobody will be forgotten, which is where the campaign Forgotten Limited name comes from. However, as the previous 2 ladies have said, we were. So sat at home, shielding, can't go out to work. So the first thing that was clear was that we were not going to get any help. Limited company directors, of which I and my wife are one, were excluded from support delivery for a number of reasons, but the main one given was fraud risk. So remember, after all we've heard over recent weeks about the level of fraud, we were denied support because we were a fraud risk. So that doesn't sit very well with many people when you see who's had the money. I tried to get ARG support locally. A lot of money was given locally, but I didn't fit the criteria because I don't pay business rates, because I don't work from home, I don't have a factory, I go out. And the second reason I was denied a number of times was I was told that other businesses were worse affected than mine. Now I'm going to share with you my income over that first year declined by 97%. So my profit in the previous 3 years had sat between the £40,000 and £50,000 range. So if I'd have been suitable for SEISS, then I would have got at the upper end of SEISS at that level of profit. Obviously, it was accidental. Who knew this was coming? But the ARG, my local council, Cheshire and Cheshire West, decided that I wasn't going to get any money because other people had been worse affected than me, even though I had lost 97% of my income. My income has not been quite as bad as Anita's. I haven't lost everything, but my income over the past 2 years has been £6,000. That's what I've earned over the past 2 years. ARG couldn't get. I should put a caveat that right at the end, I did get £2,000. I appealed against it and I said, show me who's worse off than me. And I got £2,000 off them at the end. Furlough comes up. It's not widely known, but I'm sure you do, that if you are a limited company director and you furlough, you are not allowed to work on the business. You can only do statutory work. So I can fill in my tax returns, I can fill in my VAT returns, but I can't try and keep businesses, and I certainly can't try and get new businesses. So I was sat at home shielding, and I decided not to take furlough, though I could have done, because I wanted to try and keep the business going. I wanted to keep in contact with my customers. I wanted to try and get some business while I was locked up at home. I wasn't that successful, as you've heard from my income, but a lot of people don't understand. As a company director, if you furlough, you cannot work the business. So I chose not to take furlough for a while until it became clear that this wasn't going well. And so towards the tail end of the furlough scheme, I did, and I took some furlough for a period of time. I did take a bounce back loan, and I was able to get £14,500 as a bounce back loan. It's a debt that I'm going to have to repay back going forward, but I did get a bounce back loan. I should say we did spend a lot of time talking to the likes of Jesse Norman as a campaign, and every hurdle they put in front of us, limited directors, we addressed in the scheme that we brought up called the DIS, that was us and a number of other people. And they came back, and because we'd knocked away all the planks of the reasons not to give us support, all they were left with was fraud. So the last communication we had from the Treasury, signed by Jesse Norman, was, no, you're a fraud risk. Sorry, you're not getting any money. So where it's ended up, I've had to, I'm old enough, as you can see, I'm old enough to raid my pension pot. So I raided my pension pot to keep going. And 6-7 months ago, my wife and I decided enough was enough. So we decided to sell our house. We sold our house. We are moving into a very small place this Friday coming. That will be that. So call that a forced downsize to do that. But that put some money in the bank and it's kept us going. So as I said at the top end, I'm not a poster boy for people who've been excluded because I had assets I could sell. But the bottom line is I've had to sell a lot of assets. I've had to sell my big assets. I've had to raid my pension pots, and all because I'm sure you can see, I'm clearly a fraud risk. And all those people who've got the bounce back loan money and the robbers and the bank robbers and the foreign criminals weren't a fraud risk. I'm not bitter.
Thanks, Keith. And good luck with the move on Friday. And thank you for doing this, a stressful thing to do on top of a stressful week. We really appreciate it.
It's okay. I've done plenty, Leila. It's okay.
Thank you. Baroness Brinton.
Yes, thank you very much. And can I just say I'm really sorry that myself and Lady Finlay have to leave at midday. So we will catch up online afterwards with your other answers. All three of you spoken about the personal loss that you've incurred. I wondered if you could just explain to us about the loss to your business, about growth. Is this like going back to day one? Is it worse than day one? Anything else that, from your business perspective that you would want us to know about?
And can I plead brevity?
Okay, I'll dive in very quickly. Most of my services were to hospitality as well. Hospitality is burdened down with debt. So whereas I'm out there punching out and fighting, it's very difficult to get business in the hospitality industry because of the state it's in. So at this moment in time, I'm earning about £250 a month, but I'm still working at it.
Anita?
Well, the business I took the bounce back loan to keep the business going, and everyone I have felt like giving up. There have been times, but everyone keeps saying, look, travel's going to come back and it will come back big. So, but my clients are of the older end. I have a clientele and they're very scared to travel. So it's going to be hard to build it back up. And I've tried to do different things, but it's hard. But yeah, the business it is like starting all over again. But I have to try and see that as a positive and be excited about it. So.
Thank you. Pauline.
Mine was just a 1 year. It was from the pandemic, because obviously everybody's transferred training onto virtual. So my last year was the same as my first year in terms of what I've made. So mine was a 1 year blip, but a 1 year very serious, like, horrible time.
Thank you. Leila.
Thank you very much. Exemplary brief answers. Thank you so much all. Lord Russell.
Yes, so Pauline, if I can start with you, how have you coped with, and what impact has the sort of constantly changing rules and guidance had on you? And to what extent has that made things worse, or have you been able to follow the rules and guidance in a reasonably straightforward manner?
Oh, of course, I've followed the rules and the guidance, and it hasn't really impacted my business. I'm not doing global stuff as much. I'm doing it's more UK based. So mine's is back on track. So I'll hand it over to the others.
Anita?
Well, the ever-changing rules of travel, of course, the confidence of travel has been very low. And I understand that totally, because I'm even scared to take bookings and give money to suppliers, because I don't know what's coming next. So I can understand that confidence in travel has been very low, and changing rules, people are scared to book and to commit. So I've had to kind of really contract on a very flexible basis myself for anything that I'm doing this year even. So that's made it a lot more difficult, but as I say, hopefully the confidence will come back in the next few months.
Has insurance, or did insurance cover any of your problems at all, or were they unhelpful?
Well, to be honest, I have supplier failure cover and all the covers before COVID. I had everything covered, but I haven't had to actually claim. I'm quite proud to say that I managed to get every penny back that I'd paid suppliers and airlines, even though I'd paid back my clients first. So I've got to say everybody was pretty good in that respect. But legally you have to be covered anyway. But it's more difficult to get the insurance nowadays, actually.
Yeah. No. Understandably. Thank you very much. Keith, please.
Thank you. Yeah, as I mentioned, I work largely in hospitality, which is a very challenged arena. So what I've chosen to do is, because I have a very low boredom threshold, and I'm not one to sit around and worried about things. So I'm doing 2 contracts at the minute, which I'm doing pro bono, because I have to, because they have no money. But obviously I'm working on the basis that if I can help them get through this, then somewhere down the track, maybe we'll still come along. In the meantime, we're living off the equity of the house sale. Obviously, that's what we are, and the pension as well. So free work is what I'm doing at this moment in time. Hopefully that will change.
Right. Thank you very much. Leila, back to you.
Well, thank you. Over to Barbara Keeley, MP.
Thank you all, and I can tell it's been such a difficult time for you. So this is perhaps a nice question to have to answer. Looking back, what support would have been most helpful throughout the pandemic?
Cease.
Yeah, Pauline, start with you.
Cease. So I lost in monetary terms 45,000. If I had got the 3 cease payments, and I was one of the ones to get the concession of the 600,000 in. So I did get 4 and 5, which cleared my bounce back loan and my time to pay tax, because not only are you not earning money or earning a fraction of what you're earning, you've obviously still got your tax bill. So you're living off the money that you've saved for your tax bill. It was never ending. If we're a fraud list, if you don't want to give us money, don't make us pay that tax as well. There was multiple ways that they could have done this. So I was £45,000 down. If I'd have got the 3 cease, it would have been 21,000. It wouldn't have covered my losses, but it would seriously have helped.
Yeah, thank you.
Better than the 0.
Yeah, thank you. Anita, how about you?
Yeah, give us something, monitor where the money was going. Be fair. I think for me, I just wanted to be treated fairly. I saw the money coming out, and not having anything, it really hurt. And financially, I've just lived off my savings and handouts from my family over the last 2 years, which is awful. It's horrible. But to give you something, not give you nothing and say that you're a fraudster, just even a living wage, but just something every month that you can survive. And as the others, I've got the bounce back loan, which obviously I've got a lot of debt now, which I didn't have before. I'm probably down about £60,000, and I've got a lot of debt.
Yeah, oh, sorry about that. And Keith, you've campaigned on this. What support would have been most helpful?
Well, in reality, the detailed conversations we had with Jesse Norman and the HMRC and Treasury clearly indicated they wouldn't look at anything that was massively different from what was there now. So the DIS proposal mirrored the SEISS, and consequently it had the same cap. We know the issue of the 50k cap. Somebody gets 50,000 of one profit, gets nothing. Somebody gets 49,999, gets a lot of money. But we didn't go into bat on that. So all we were looking for was to mirror the rules and regulations around size. And if that had been in place, because of my profit on the previous 3 years, between 40 and 50, I'd have got about 37k from that. And we would have managed on that. That would have been fine. And we would have been treated with parity. And that's all the Forgotten team ever wanted. It wasn't any special treatment. It was just parity, and we didn't get it.
That's quite fair. Thank you. Thanks, Keith. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, and back to Lord Russell.
Yes, thank you very much. One thing we have learned on this all-party group as we've taken evidence over the last almost 2 years is just when you think things are getting better, you know they probably aren't. So we hope Omicron is the worst of it is over, but previous experience tells us that there are likely to be more curved balls and ups and downs going forward. So looking at that, looking at the state your businesses are in at the moment, what do you or would you ideally most urgently need from the government to try and make sure that the experiences you've had so far are not repeated? Pauline.
For me, it's you know what I teach leaders. It's the power of listening. I just can't believe that, you know, they knew that this was going on and they just kept on telling us the support. But you know, you need to listen to what your people are telling you, and it was mentioned constantly in the House right up to that March Treasury. It was mentioned constantly, and they just kept on to it should not be allowed. What is that Speaker's role in the House of Commons if not to make them actually answer the question that was asked, rather than just, well, this is a script? It was bizarre.
Speaking as a crossbencher and not a member of any political party, I couldn't possibly comment.
Well, I'm just going to agree.
You make a very good point. Anita.
What they could do now, I think, really, firstly, to claw back the fraudulent money, the 4.2 billion that we've seen taken when we supposedly were the fraudsters. But I think for many in my position, that would take too long. I think really we need some kind of financial help now. We have our accounts now. We know what we've done over the worst period of the pandemic. We can prove that. I can prove I've had zero income, that I've made a loss. And I think something like paying off part of my bounce back loan would be really good, or maybe just going back and saying, well, actually, she didn't get anything. These people, let's give them. We might not make up for all of it, but give them 50% of what everyone else gets. Give them something. I think that would be really helpful right now for me personally, because I've never been in debt in my life, and I am now, and that really scares me.
Thank you very much. Keith.
Yeah, thank you. I think, like Lisa, it's something to alleviate the debt that the non-supported have had to take on when others didn't. So some form of forgiveness on bounce back loans would be good. In general, we just think the lessons for this particular government, I'm going to say it, is not to troll people like us by telling what they've given everybody else. And also, and I will say it's irrelevant to you, the Chancellor twice when he was interviewed asked about our situation, feigned deafness. Twice he actually said, I'm sorry, I can't hear what you're talking about. And I think that's a particularly evil thing to do when you've heard, and we are by no means the worst of the people affected. There'll be people who are worse affected than us. As Pauline knows, people have taken their lives. I'm not a trained counsellor. I've had to be a counsellor for members of Forgotten Limited. I'm sure Pauline has for Excluded as well. The state people have got into is horrendous. But at this moment in time, we are where we are. About forgiveness on a bounce back loan would be something, but in reality, we don't really expect anything.
Well, thank you all three very much. I mean, I'm very forcibly reminded listening to the three of you that as was the case during most of the pandemic, the majority of people actually did follow the rules and did do what was asked of them and did think about others, which clearly all three of you have done. And thank you very much for doing that, even if you aren't getting very many thanks from the government, but a very large personal thank you from me, and I'm sure the rest of us. And over to you, Leila.
Thank you. No, I completely echo that. I have a question, which, and you know, Anita, I think you kind of said it already, but I do want to dive into this idea that you were given the excuse of fraud for why at the time they wouldn't support you. Keith, can I ask you, in your discussions with Jessie Norman, that final email, I mean, the idea that somehow this was going to lead to sort of mass fraud, can you just unpick that a little bit for us? Where did this come from? Why did they get that impression? And what's your view of what they were trying to do there?
The first thing to say is that the reason for the fraud excuse was that they were determined not to support us. So we need to say that first. There are elements within the Treasury, Jim Harrott and others, who clearly see every limited company director of a small nature as what's called a TMI, which is a tax motivated incorporation. So they think we all are only limited company directors because we can save the price of a pint of beer a week on tax. And it is that, literally, it's about £5 a week going forward. The reality was, what they said was, they were concerned that by incorporating dividend payment as income in any calculation, there would be people in a business who were not working in the business, but were taking a dividend. So somebody like me and my wife, we work in the business, if we took a dividend, which we do, now and again, that's us. But they said there will be other companies who've got sleeping partners, whatever you want to call them, who get paid a dividend. And if we were to support them, even though they are not working in the business, we would be giving money away to people who didn't deserve it. Mm-hmm. We asked for evidence of how many this number was. They didn't have an idea. They had never had an idea on the number. But they didn't even know how many limited company directors there were, incidentally. You know, we do, but they didn't. So it was all about not wanting to reward, through taxpayers' money, directors who were not participating in the business. That was ultimately their final reason not to support us. Once the DIS, incidentally, go back to the DIS, had dealt with all of their internal admin issues between HMRC and Treasury. It dealt with that. And crucially, the DIS did not take dividends into account. So there was no dividends in the DIS to be worried about by HMRC and the Treasury. But still, we got fraud risks thrown back at us in their last communication.
And so, and this is to all three of you. Obviously, the last couple of weeks in particular, but even you know, Lord Agnew resigning in the Lords over the scale of the fraud, I think we all cheered, and I think people even clapped in the Lords, which is just outrageous. Thank goodness for the Lords at the moment. But I was just really struck, hearing your stories about how you followed the rules and how you were being accused of being fraudsters, when in this week we've seen a minister stand up and do the right thing, saying that he was trying to tackle that fraud at the time and, quote, no one seemed to care. How does that make you feel? And I'd like to hear from everyone about that. Can I start with Anita?
Well, it does make me feel very angry and bitter. And I went through that phase during the pandemic when I felt like that, when I realised we weren't going to get any support. So I had to stop myself, because I'm not an angry and bitter person, and it's not good. But it's I don't know. It's unbelievable that they were accusing us of, they don't know me. Oh, I'm a fraud. I won't get support because they think I might be fraudulent. And yet 4 point whatever billion has gone, and they don't want to investigate. It's just ridiculous. In fact, I have to turn the TV off. I can't even watch, because it puts me in the wrong place, because I'm trying to be in a good place at the moment to focus on getting my business back, and you can't do that if you're angry and bitter.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Anita. Pauline?
Invisible.
Invisible.
I've been a higher rate taxpayer for years. In fact, the 50/50, it was my redundancy payment, which HRMC in that 1 month got 27,000. I've always paid in. I don't have a problem with the amount of tax I pay, but then to get nothing back, bizarre. It's just, so I just feel invisible. I know, and as I say, I did vote for them, but I now feel, you know, they're in a different club and I'm not in that club. Yeah.
Thank you. And Keith?
Yeah, thank you. I think, how do we make it feel? Let's go back to this again, because I was part of the construction of that, is that, our books are signed off by accountants. You know, we're not independent people who are legally required and responsible if they tell lies. So our books are signed off by an independent, in effect, auditor anyway. How does it make me feel? I'm just going to spread it wider to the wider Forgotten Limited group. It's a fact that we've put out many times, is that there are 102 Conservative MPs with more people who were denied support than the size of their majority. Okay, 102, including Boris Johnson. He's got a smaller majority than the number of people who his party denied support. And you've heard from Pauline, you've heard from Anita, is that this is something that will never be forgotten. Personally, in my spare time, and I had a lot over the lockdown, I went through all my P60s back to when I first started work, and I've paid in direct taxes, never mind indirect, £1.6 million in my working career, in income tax and national insurance payment. £1.6 million I've personally paid, just me, in my working career. Yet and so let's go back. I was told to shield, so I couldn't work. The industries I work in were closed down, so I couldn't do that. When I had my moment of need, the only time I've had a moment of need in my entire life from the government, they said, "Nah, you're a fraudster." And a bit like everybody else, I've never missed a tax payment. Every penny I've ever been asked for, I have paid. I've never been behind in payment. I've always been on the ball, because far from being a fraudster, like everybody else in our game, we are legal, decent and honest people. And there was an article in Conservative Home back in May, June 2020, and the writer basically said, this policy, and it was a policy of not supporting people, is a needless political own goal and a moral misstep. And politics, I don't want to talk about, but it was certainly a moral misstep going forward. And for the 2 million people nearly in our group, it will never, ever be forgotten or forgiven.
And on that note, I think that very neatly rounds off one of the key messages we need to take forward. I want to thank you all for your time this morning. I found your stories really moving. And actually, I also think your compassion for others was very clear too. You all took pains to say that there are others worse off than you. But bluntly, I think your stories are pretty bad. And you didn't receive that support, and it's not good enough. And the purpose of the all-party group is to try and raise those voices, but also to call for some of those actions that might make restitution. Ones I've heard today is clawing back some of that money that real fraudsters took, and also helping you all with your debts that you've needlessly had to incur because of their policy decision, which I couldn't agree more is definitely a moral misstep, is a polite way of saying it. So thank you all very much for your time. We're going to move on to panel 2. You are very, very welcome to stay. Keith, if you've got boxes to pack, you are very welcome to go off and do that as well. You're busy people. I appreciate that. Please keep in touch with the all-party group, continue to talk to us, and we'll be in touch too with further recommendations and the report that we'll write up off the back of this. But thank you all for your time, and thank you for sharing your stories. Take care, everybody. Okay, so we now move not exactly to organizations who themselves gained, but organizations who can give us some insight into those who had the polar opposite experience, it would seem, of the first panel. And I'm delighted that they're all with us now. So we have Tom Watson, the fairly newly appointed chair of the LTIO, that's the Laboratory and Testing Industry Organization. And that's the trade association for the testing industry, covering testing companies and laboratories. Welcome, Tom. We are also joined by Natalie Kennedy, who's the CEO of BioGrade Lab. BioGrade Diagnostics provide COVID-19 testing to travel for pre-travel day 2, day 8, and test to release. And we also have with us Susanna Fitzgerald from Transparency International. And Transparency International is a leading non-governmental anti-corruption organization. Their research on government procurement has been cited both in the House of Commons extensively, but also in the media. Thank you all very much for joining us. So I think just to start by sort of setting the scene, if you could start by giving us a brief overview of what your organization does, please. And if I could start with Tom.
Thanks, Leila, and it is lovely to see my former colleagues again. I promise not to ask you for all the gossip on this particular inquiry, although I'm desperate to. Firstly, what is the LTIO? What does it do? Why am I its chair? We're a new body. We were only founded at the end of September, beginning of October last year. It's a trade and standards body. I was appointed 3 weeks ago. Let me just tell you why. I went on a health journey when I was an MP. I wrote a book about it called Downsizing. I became fairly obsessed with personal diagnostics. I thought that could be the next iteration of health policy, got into the world of biohacking. Some of the member companies, the LTIO has 13 member companies. Most of them have been around for a long time. They worked in different areas of life, from sports and elite sports to cancer research. And I had an interest. As a former civil contingencies minister, someone who's been on a cabinet committee dealing with the pandemic, and actually been trained as a minister where we modelled a COBA dealing with a pandemic, they thought that it was a good fit. And they really came together when the government websites for travel testing came about, and the government in its wisdom decided to put the price of tests on the website, and all sorts of new entrants to the market used really bad form behavior, unethical behavior to try and game the system to get people, advertising PCR tests as cheap as 33p. And actually, rather like the small business people we've just seen, our members were doing the right thing and were very concerned that the whole industry was going to get tainted because of the bad behaviour of others. So one of the things they did within weeks of the inception was engage with government and government agencies to try to say, look, you've got a perverse outcome here. You're trying to help consumers, but actually what you're actually doing is allowing them to be hoodwinked and misled by bad players. And like all these things, when these companies that were working in different areas of life and in a fairly competitive, some of them in fairly competitive markets came together, they realised that good could come from bad. And what we needed to do was talk to the government about wider public policy issues for an emerging, maturing industry. And that's kind of where they're at. And that's why they brought me in. But as you saw with the written evidence, there is really, there's very shoddy behaviour. And there are some companies out there that have deliberately profited from the government trying to help consumers do the right thing when it comes to securing travel around the world.
Thank you, Tom. And if I may perhaps go to Natalie next. So Natalie, could you tell us a bit about BioGrade, but also how you became involved in PCR testing in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. So BioGrade is established by was established by scientists, and the core of the business actually was education. So we would train postgraduate, postdoctoral level scientists from, before COVID, it was from 521 institutes in 21 countries. So we were an elite training provider for scientists that wanted to get into very novel, very specific, very niche research, and we had a very good reputation for doing that. We also have a regenerative medicine centre and a stem cell foundation for rheumatoid arthritis and leukemia research, and we have some rheumatoid arthritis and leukemia research that we do as well. So we've got quite a lot of caps. Our core business of education, which was basically what we were doing, is our income from education was then funding our research, which was wonderful. We were giving a lot of bursaries out. We consider ourselves an ethical company. And when COVID hit, it meant effectively we couldn't do our training courses anymore. So we would have been hit quite severely. And for me, my main concern was being able to keep my scientists. I had a number of scientists on the book, and yes, they'd have been furloughed, but the money that we would have got from the government would not have actually funded to keep the laboratories open. Our lab costs are huge. We've got city centre labs where we train people, so that £10,000 wouldn't have covered our costs. So we would have had to close during COVID if we hadn't been able to find something else to do. So in the very, very early days of COVID, before COVID tests were available on the NHS, we started doing our own PCR COVID tests for our own students, and then we reached out to our schools and universities in the UK, and we contacted them and just asked how they were doing. They were educational companies like we were, and a lot of them came back with the same information, that if they couldn't find a way to safely and effectively open their doors to international students in September, they would not be able to continue either. They'd lost a lot of income in the spring term. So we reached out and said, well, we've got the equipment in, we have the staff, and we can cover the costs of our staff. But if you want to just pay the cost price for the reagents, we will come and test your students just for that cost price. So we started doing mass testing in British schools and universities as early as July, because some of those schools opened slightly earlier because they'd missed a term, the independent schools. And then from there, what happened was, after we were doing several thousand tests a day at cost price, we weren't making any profit on that, but it was just enough to keep our labs open, in the hope that COVID would be a short-term thing, as I think everybody thought it would be, and that we would go back into our education in September. What happened in September was a lot of the parents that had seen our mass testing programs then got in touch and said, actually, we can't, I've got 3 factories, or I've got two business centres, we can't open that without support. So we started providing PCR tests really early on. Then we started doing outreach work in our communities. So we took marquees out and we started doing antibody tests they were 36 to begin with, and they went down to £25 because the cost of them went down as we bought more. And the same with our PCR test, the cost came down as we bought more. It was never meant to make a profit. It was just to keep our business going, so that when the pandemic finishes, we still have an education business that we can run. And it was working really, really well. One of the main issues that we've had around profiteering was in about October. COVID wasn't regulated. COVID testing wasn't really regulated up until around October, November 2020. And then we were told that if we wanted to do COVID lab tests, PCR tests, that we would have to be UCAS accredited. And at the time, nobody in the UK was UCAS accredited because COVID was a new thing. So we were told that we had 6 months to pass our accreditation. So 2 months to pass level 1, 2 months past level 2, 2 months past level 3. We were one of only 6 companies that passed all 3 levels, and we kept our prices as cheap as possible. Now, for us, the big frustration is that there doesn't seem to have been any policing around that. So we've put a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of energy into hitting all of those government requirements. But it's very easy to find a loophole in those government requirements and still be on the government website. So, and I guess it's something that we'll come to later on, but that's why we started getting into COVID testing.
Thank you. That's really comprehensive. Really appreciate that reply. Thank you. And Susanna.
Hi, thank you for having us on and for holding this important inquiry session. I think it's really good that you're looking at this angle for the pandemic. So I work for Transparency International UK, which is the UK chapter of the Global Transparency International movement, which comprises over 100 chapters worldwide. And so as you pointed out, we're a charity that raises awareness about corruption. We advocate for legal and regulatory reform to ensure that we've got the necessary safeguards in place to prevent corruption. And we act as a leading centre of anti-corruption expertise in the UK. So we're independent, non-political, and base all of our advocacy on robust research, including the report that you mentioned in your introduction there as well, Track and Trace, which looked at contracting during the pandemic.
Lovely, thank you very much. And we're going to dive into that momentarily. If I can pass to Caroline Lucas, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, I wanted to come to Susanna straight away, if I might. As you say, you published the report on Track and Trace, and you noted that at the time, 65 of the 73 contracts relating to COVID-19 were questionable contracts. And I wonder if you could expand on what you mean by that and what criteria you use to define the word questionable.
Sure. So just to quickly clarify the statistic that you used in your question. So we identified 73 contracts that merited further investigation in our report, as you pointed out, with 65 of these being for PPE. However, the actual number of contracts that we looked at was much larger. So the timeframe for our research was February to November 2020. And during this time, we found 998 contracts worth just under £18 billion that related to the pandemic. So that was 7.8% of all the contracts awarded during that time, because of course there was still regular procurement going on beyond what was happening with the pandemic. So then from these 998 contracts, we found 73 that merited further investigation, and that represented £3.8 billion worth of spending. So 65 of these were for PPE, which were worth £2.9 billion. At least 24 of these PPE contracts worth £1.6 billion went to those with non-political connections to the party of government in Westminster right now. And 14 companies incorporated in 2020 received contracts worth over £620 million. So that doesn't give a particularly long amount of time for them to be operating before those contracts were awarded, given the time frame of our research. So then we found that corruption red flags were identified in over £1 of every £5 spent on the pandemic procurement response between February and November 2020, which is a very, very high amount. And so just to come to the point you raised about how we identified which contracts were questionable. So we did this by compiling a list of red flags from integrity risks developed by the OECD. So this included things like uncompetitive tendering, vague or improper rationale for contract awards, opaque contracting, so that kind of relates to issues around documentation, egregious breaches of procedure, again, kind of coming into these documentation issues, companies seemingly unsuitable for the work. So the companies I mentioned that had only been recently formed would fall into that category, or things like abnormally high pricing. So we have a full list of 15 red flags in an annex of our report, which I'd be happy to share with members of the APPG if this was of interest. And the way that we got this information was we pulled data from Tenders Electronic Daily, also known as TED, which is kind of where all contracts are uploaded, from FOI requests, and from open source material like media reports or court documents. And one thing I should maybe just quickly add as well is just that essentially what we mean when we say corruption red flags. So this does not necessarily mean that corruption took place, but that the activity surrounding the contract increases the risk that it has. So it's hard to identify corruption at the best of times, because by definition it goes on kind of covertly and secretly, but it's particularly difficult in a crisis situation, where it becomes a bit more difficult to distinguish between a genuine cause for concern and something that might be an inadvertent administrative mistake. And so that's why one of the key things we called for in our report was to have a full audit of these 73 questionable contracts so that we could actually get to the bottom of what's gone on with them. So hopefully that gives a decent overview of what we have.
That's great, thank you. And I think we'd certainly like to see that annex, so thank you very much for that. Just a very quick follow-up. You explained the particular timescale that you were looking at, and I wondered if you could say whether you're aware if there are more politically connected companies that have received COVID-19 contracts than have been reported to date.
Unfortunately, I don't have a definite answer to that question, because we've not fully looked at the data in the way that we did for this time period, because as you can imagine, it's quite an in-depth process, but there is a chance, but I can't answer that for certain, unfortunately.
Thanks so much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Really very interesting. Susanna, can I just ask, is the NAO all over this, to your understanding?
Yes, so in November 2020, I think, or potentially December, they released a report which identified the VIP lane that I'm sure most of you have heard of. Yes. And kind of outlined a lot of their problems that they identified as well.
Okay, thank you very much. If I can go to Lord Russell, please.
Yes, thank you. This is a question for Tom and for Natalie, please. So I think you've submitted written evidence about some of the challenges that the testing industry is facing. So could you give us a quick overview of your key concerns around testing providers, have you raised these concerns directly with the DHSC? If so, how has the DHSC responded to you? Do you consider their responses satisfactory? And what, in your view, is driving whatever responses you're getting from the department? So, Tom, that's a series of questions. I'm sure you'll remember them all from your political career. And if you could go first, please.
Okay, I've got a number of goals in answering your question. The one is not to try and contradict Natalie, whose organisation is a member of the LTIO, which is always dangerous. Yes, I think from the early days of the LTIO from last autumn, the very grave concern of our members was that actually, for all the right reasons, government were taking decisions to allow consumers knowledge of who was providing private testing for travel. But they pointed out the pitfall of pricing, and they pointed out very clearly, very early on numerous occasions, that unscrupulous providers were gaming the system. And even now, there is still a pricing element to the website. They say it's temporary. They're saying there's a minimum rate of £15. And last time we checked, there were about 20 providers offering services for £15. But I think any credible provider would say to you that's got to be a limited offer, because it's very hard to offer a PCR test for that level. I think the average price of a PCR test is about £83. So that's a very grave concern. Earlier on, there were very small numbers of people that were gaming the system with the use of the passenger locator form and that we used. But given the scale of travel, that was limited. Though it was a sort of loophole that people could exploit if individuals deliberately wanted to try and get around the rules. And I think our other concern is actually, one of the concerns was ministerial decisions taken almost in a vacuum without the sector having any signalling of when that change would come, that would create very great problems in administration. So, for example, you decide you're going to remove the requirement to travel for PCR tests. Last time round, when they dropped the burden, there was a 5-day notice. One of our member organisations had to give 30,000 refunds in that period of time. And so one of the goals of our body is to try and build a relationship with government, so that very often, in good governance, signalling direction of travel so people can prepare for big changes was one of the things we're trying to achieve. But I think the pricing thing was the big one, and that really did allow consumers to be misled by very unscrupulous providers.
What has the department's response been?
Well, they acknowledge the body that we were talking to, the UK HSA. They acknowledge there is a problem with it. They acknowledge actually that the £15 minimum pricing is an attempt to get round it, but it's only temporary. I mean, the obvious thing to do is just not put the pricing up there, and then you get rid of the perverse incentive. But it's been going on for 6 months, 4, 5, 6 months now at least, that we've been pointing this out, and there's still a problem.
Right, Natalie, this is your chance to hang out your dirty washing. Go for it.
So I'd have to agree with Tom there. I mean, the cost is a really difficult thing for us. We've offered them as cheaply as we can throughout, but we are never the cheapest on the government list. Our price is our price. Our postal price is our in-clinic self-test is £19.99, our postal is £40. Yet consistently, all of the government says the more expensive PCR test. Now, PCR tests don't need to be this much more expensive. Part of it is that there is profiteering. So there are companies, and this is one of the prerequisites of being in LTIO, which is why I'm a founding member, because we could see people profiteering. I don't believe that they should be profiteering in a pandemic. And one of the issues are that, yes, we had to be UCAS accredited to get on that government list. But the original sort of legislation stated that you could be on the list for the first 2 months. And then if you didn't pass level 1, then you would be removed. And what's happened is a lot of companies now are just changing their names. So we had one company, for example, that will remain nameless. They bought 1,000 tests from us, but they sold 19,000 tests to consumers. 19,000. They didn't buy them from us. They just sold 19,000 tests. Now, we reported them to DHSC and they were removed from the list, but then 2 or 3 weeks later, they shut down that company, reopened another company, and we are seeing companies have 3 or 4 reiterations of this. And it's very difficult when those companies of the LTIO and those companies that are out there doing the very best that we can to help people out through the pandemic and keeping our prices as low as possible, when actually we can see that other people are profiteering. So for those of us that are doctors and scientists and medics and have worked through the front line of the pandemic and are doing 20-hour shifts and have not stopped for nearly 2 years, it is so frustrating to be tarnished with the same brush. The other thing around pricing should be much cheaper than it is. We've managed to keep it quite cheap. But the issue that we have, and it's the same as what Tom's already mentioned, is this inconsistency in policy. So we could be cheaper. But when we price, as I've already mentioned earlier, labs are expensive. And now we have hundreds and hundreds of staff. When the government states that we have to, the travel testing comes back, suddenly we have this huge influx of bookings or people that want to change the lateral flow devices to PCRs. Now we have 140 something staff that sit in a call center and answer the phones to change everybody's bookings over. So instead of just paying scientists to run COVID tests, we are paying for hundreds of admin staff to swap from one test to the other. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, the government might decide that actually you need lateral flows. So then we either have to refund or we have to move back to lateral flows. This expectation that the private sector is just here and will be here with 2 or 3 days notice, right now it's exhausting. I think we're at the end now. We are exhausted. It's the inconsistency that's very difficult for us. The other thing is scientists aren't on minimum wage jobs. The majority of our scientists are doctors. They're postdoctoral scientists. They're very experienced in what they do. They're virologists. They've undergone UCAS. They've got worlds of experience behind them, and so they are paid appropriately. And our labs, because we've had to go through all the UCAS, we have all our quality control people. We have all of these extra members of staff. Now they are all on contracts, and we've expanded our lab provision. We've invested more into PCR machines, which is fine. But we price our tests knowing that we might only have 3 weeks worth of work and then we go back to lateral flows. So our overheads are being covered for the whole 12 months. Whereas if the government were to say that COVID testing it's going to be consistent, then we can effectively plan and drop our prices even further. We won't need to employ so many staff. And the other thing is we have a sudden influx in staff when every time there's a change in regulation. Those staff are agency staff, they're paid more money than our our standard staff. And so for us, the inconsistency in regulation is bumping up COVID test prices, not to the prices that are being reported in the press, not this 80, 90 pound a test. That is crazy. But they're still keeping them up there at that 40 pound. So that's the biggest issue and the biggest frustration, I think. We have, like Tom said, we have reported things to DHSC. They've been really great, actually, very supportive. The only issue that we've really found is that DHSC seems to have the responsibility to police this, but without having the power to really effectively do very much other than take people off the list. So I think we can see from the people that we're working with at DHSC, they're always very, very welcoming of our suggestions, and we do speak with them daily. But I think there's a frustration from DHSC as well as to the lack of power, because the way that the legislation sits, people can find these loopholes and continue profiteering.
Thank you very much.
Natalie, thank you. Your frustration is palpable, and I think the lack of being joined up that you've just mentioned chimes very, very strongly with what Lord Agnew said when he resigned last week, which is the left hand really not only doesn't know what the right hand's doing, it doesn't seem terribly interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Barbara Keeley.
Thanks, Chair. Well, let me start with Susanna and some follow-up questions for transparency about, I mean, you've talked about the 65 questionable contracts, and I think you said the figures were for PPE contracts, 2.9 billion, but were in those questionable contracts, and 1.6 billion to people with known connections. And I just want to explore around that, because as Simon Russell has just said, Lord Agnew is quoted in the Times on these VIP contracts saying that he operated a simple brutal triage system. Every day I would ring what looked like the most credible of the emails that came in overnight, talk to a person for 10 minutes and then decide So it just looks like senior ministers were making those decisions. He was making those decisions without any tender process. His tender process was his brutal triage system. How does that tie in with what you've found in transparency about why certain companies were given contracts?
Yeah, so the VIP lane in this sort of triage system is one of the areas that we were most concerned about in our research. To this day, I still don't understand what the rationale was for it and what qualifications MPs or ministers necessarily have to assess what contracts will be best. And I think maybe if we were in a war or something like this, would you be triaging offers of supplies for weapons or for something else? No, you would never have that. And it's the exact same thing with medical equipment. If you don't have the expertise, how can you possibly assess which contracts are going to be the best supplies? And I think this was also something the National Audit Office, just to pick up on Layla's question before, we're really concerned about as well. And the evidence from their research shows that actually this VIP lane, it really did result in success. I think companies that went through this lane were 10 times more likely to be awarded a contract. So, even if we were to be gracious and say that this was well-intentioned and it was a crisis and people were just trying to do what they thought was best, that doesn't stop it being an incredibly flawed approach to pandemic procurement. And I think even the suggestion of politicians or MPs being involved in this process really should have started alarm bells ringing within government. And I think there's a real question for the UK for why it didn't, and like how we consider issues of corruption and whether we are as aware of the risks that there are that this can pose. And I think also something that's worth noting with the VIP lane is that in other areas of economic activity, anyone with a political connection is subject to more scrutiny rather than less scrutiny, precisely because of these corruption risks. I mean, just ask any anti-money laundering compliance officer worth their salt, and they will tell you that exactly. So I'm yet to understand quite why this approach was gone for, and I think that's something that we really need to get answers from the government.
We do, don't we? How was the transparency around this? How did you find it investigating it?
Difficult is the short answer, I think. And there's definitely not been enough transparency. So ultimately, it's impossible to understand the logic of why some companies were successful and why some weren't from the publicly available data. So there's some systemic kind of structural reasons for that. So there's some low publication thresholds for contracts. There's an inability to link expenditure data from contracting authorities to the actual contracts awarded. And it's also not routine for evaluation criteria or assessment to be published. And it was very rare in the cases of these PPE contracts that would help you actually look at two companies' bids and see, okay, which would have been the best. But we don't really have any of that information. And then there's specific issues as well surrounding the way that procurement was conducted during the pandemic. So we found 72% of identifiable COVID-related contracts were awarded after the 30-day legal deadline.
Can you just say that again? Sorry, the sound isn't very good. 72% of?
Sorry. So that there's a 30-day legal deadline that you're supposed to publish all contracts within, and 72% of the identifiable COVID-related contracts that we found from our research were published after this. So that's £13.3 billion worth of contracts. And from that amount, 7.4 billion were reported 100 days after the contract award. So this is actually a breach of legal obligations. It's very serious. And it's worth also noting that details for 93% of the contracts that we identified as being awarded to politically connected companies were published late. And this is 23% higher than the companies without political connections, which was at 70%. So
yeah. Could you just give us those last figures again? Because they're astonishing figures, aren't they? Yeah.
Of course, yeah, lots of stats are being thrown at you. So the 93% of the contracts that we identified as having political connections were published late. But for all of the contracts that we identified as being related to the COVID response, the rate for late publication was 70%. So that means that there was a higher rate of late publication for these politically connected contracts.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. And can I ask you too, Natalie? We know that there were reputable organisations that could supply PPE sitting around not being contacted. Did Biograde apply for any government contracts?
We did, yeah.
Can you tell us about the process and how it affected you then?
Yeah, there was an antibody efficacy, effectively a vaccine efficacy contract that went out about a year ago. It was online. It never opened. It was online for less than 24 hours. It disappeared off the website within 24 hours and then reappeared a few weeks later to say it had already been completed. We contacted, I can't remember exactly who we contacted, but we did contact whoever put out that tender, and we didn't really get a satisfactory response. The response was a little garbled. It didn't quite make any sense as to what had gone on. So we sent an email to say, I think there's been a bit of an error here. We would really like to bid on this contract, but it's disappeared. Is there an issue with that? And nothing. We submitted an application for an NHS procurement for PCR testing, and we didn't get any response at all.
Sorry, didn't catch that.
That was for an NHS procurement contract. We didn't get any response from that at all. And there was a COVID PCR contract that, again, the same as the antibody one, it went online. It completed before you could apply for it. So it disappeared off the website and came back as completed. So at that point, we stopped applying for government contracts. Now, DHSC have contacted us on multiple occasions and asked us, do we have any capacity for supporting government testing, which we absolutely do. And regularly we're asked to submit how many tests we have available, and yet nobody's ever taken us up on that.
It's astonishing when we think about the periods, I think over Christmas, New Year, when there wasn't any testing capacity, were there? I know that, care homes and others were not getting tests back in anything like a sensible time. That's astonishing. That's an astonishing.
So we have a 24-hour turnaround. We do a 6-hour turnaround. The majority of our tests come around back in 16 hours. And I think we had over Christmas, about 10,000 capacity excess per day that we could have offered to DHSC. Nobody's ever taken us up on this, which is why we've had to open them up to the private sector. But we've been sitting here for the whole, in fact, before we were one of the first labs to be accredited, yet no, we've never had a contract, and we've applied, never been given anything.
It's appalling. Thank you. Thanks, Natalie. Back to you, Chair.
Gosh, thank you very much. Simon, Lord Russell.
Yes, Susanna, this is for you. You mentioned when you were talking about transparency that it is a very international organization. So lots of other countries have been going through a similar experience to us. So how does our approach to UK COVID procurement compare with other countries? And I will leave it up to you to choose which countries might be the best examples to use to sort of bring this into sharp focus.
Sure. So, well, we don't have like a kind of a report for each different country like we did. We do definitely have examples of countries that manage their procurement far better than the UK. So, for example, that point I raised in the last question about publication of contracts and how there was such long delays after the award for these being published. One country that gives a really good example of how you can do this better is actually Ukraine. So they were able to publish information on over 100,000 COVID contracts on average in less than a day. So we were waiting over 100 days for some of ours, and the majority of theirs were published online during the day. So that's a staggering difference really there. There were also some countries that managed to increase the amount of contracts that were awarded through open competition, unlike us where we saw a lot of direct awarding going on. So I think Slovakia, Estonia, Hungary, Croatia, Sweden, and Latvia all saw decreases in the proportion of contracts awarded directly during the pandemic. And so I think one of the problems that has been picked up for the UK is just how poorly prepared we were for this. So depleted stockpiles have been mentioned a lot of the time when it comes to PPE, but there's also a kind of a broader systemic issue with our approach to public procurement, which is very outdated. So Ukraine, for example, use an open contracting approach, which is digitized, offers end-to-end transparency over the contract from bid through to award and implementation. So you can really see at each step what's going on. You've got full transparency for the public there. And to be fair to the government, their planned procurement bill would bring in these changes, but it's absolutely essential that they're brought in full, that any potential loopholes are addressed, and that they're fully resourced, which has been a common problem across lots of government reforms that they've tried to bring in. So I think on that comparative or comparison question, I think ultimately it's just really important to push back against the narrative that because we were in a pandemic, because we're in a crisis situation, that automatically makes poor practices permissible, because we know that other countries have done this better. And of course, other countries have had scandals as well. So for example, a German MP resigned over benefiting from face mask contracts. But I am yet to hear of any other country using a prioritization system like the VIP lane. So I think if there's one thing to take away from what I'm saying, this is that there really needs to be full transparency and accountability over this system. And the lack of it thus far has been really, really concerning. We would really like to see public procurement covered in the terms of reference for the COVID inquiry when they are eventually published, because I think the public just very much deserve answers on this, not just because of the public money that has been spent and misspent. I mean, I think in September we learned that £2.8 billion worth of the PPE that was ordered was ultimately unusable. That's a huge, huge amount of money. But also just the broader costs beyond financial. I mean, the potential costs to public trust that were noted by the Public Accounts Committee when they were reviewing this. And ultimately the consequences potentially for people's lives and people's health. The fact that frontline workers were put in really appalling situations, having to care for people who might have had COVID without adequate protection, is just really, it's something that should never happen, and it should never happen again. And I think that's why we need to make sure that when we do an inquiry or something like this, we are looking at it, we're looking at why we had these mistakes in comparison to other countries, and how we can stop them happening again.
Susanna, thank you very much. That's very helpful, but equally very depressing. And I'm always tempted, not that I have his number, to send a note to our wonderful Prime Minister to suggest while he's in Ukraine today, he actually looks into their procurement system and learns a lesson from it. But I suspect he wouldn't understand what it was anyway. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Lord Russell. If I could just ask a brief question now about the pricing of the tests. So both Tom and Natalie, we've spoken about this a little bit, but just sort of what is the solution? Because they're clearly trying to do something about it. It's clearly failing, and you guys have thought about this a lot. If I could start with you, Tom, what is the solution to the pricing issue?
Well, firstly, I should just say, notwithstanding the contribution Natalie's just made, the majority of members of the LTIO do not provide public services. They're in the private sector, and that they've increased supply as a result of demand in the marketplace in areas that government chose not to go into. The government took a strategic decision not to use the NHS to test for travel security and confidence, and a lot of our members filled that market. So in that sense, that healthy competition within the market over price is perhaps one way you reach a point where people really get to a point where they can sort of, there is open competition. And part of the reason why the established laboratories chose to set up the trade body was what we need is industry standards that are recognised as common standards. So to be a member of the LTIO, you have to sign a code of conduct about the sort of expectations of quality and service that people, consumers should desire, should deserve. And secondly, we used a Trustpilot score to provide some form of consumer underpinning to the services. So at least consumers would be able to be guaranteed that our members have passed a certain consumer test. And over time in a maturing sector, that's a way I think you get to show that there's a decent customer service. If I could just add one other point, Layla, what slightly worries me as well, of course, though, is there is almost a sort of, dare I say, a national security part of this, because as the private sector is scaled to meet demand, necessary demand, when government changes the regulatory obligations on citizens to travel, of course, what's actually happening now is they are, by necessity, letting staff go. There are a lot of skilled technicians and scientists now leaving our laboratories And in public policy terms, I'm worried that learning is being lost to the state. And it seems to me one of the things that ministers might want to look at is, what do they have to do if we have to scale very, very quickly on UK borders again? If we find another variant that requires much more draconian travel restrictions or even closure, the PCR test is part of that spotting. It's the border control is about viruses as well as people, and the material taken in a PCR test is what's used to sequence the testing to show new variants. And so we're slightly worried that what the private sector were doing was providing that filter, but also that the skills are being now lost again, and we'll have to recreate the wheel all over again, which again will ultimately reflect in price, because there'll be a lot more investment in trying to recruit and bring people back to the industry.
Thank you very
Sorry,
much.
that's a long-winded answer, but it's a concern for all our leaders now. They're worried about what happens if the call is made again for the private sector to step in. How do they scale? Because there's you're going to have to make those core investments again.
Absolutely. I'll pass it actually to Baroness Finlay, because the next question is very much about this area. But then also, Natalie, she'll come to you, and if you can comment on the question I've just asked as well, I'd appreciate that. Baroness Finlay.
Yes, thank you so much. I apologise that I had to drop out for a bit. But actually, this capacity for testing seems to be absolutely crucial. And I just wonder if you can expand a bit on that. Should there be another wave, a requirement for testing, how the capacity will be met, and in fact, how the procurement in the first place of which labs were asked to do testing and which were excluded, how that happened, how rigorous the process was, and whether you feel that the judgments were appropriate ones.
So to Natalie?
Yeah, Natalie.
So I agree in part with what Tom said, but I think he's aware that I disagree with another part of it, and it's been part of our healthy discussion in LTIO. So I know Tom said that there should be healthy competition around pricing in PCRs. I'm sorry, Tom, but I don't agree. There should be healthy competition. I think it's a pandemic. It's not for people to be profiteering. I think the government should set a price. I think that's part of the way that you will remove those profiteering companies from the DHSC list, because if you are simply buying COVID tests and making a whopping great profit on it, there won't be any profit to be made in it. So for me personally, that would be my recommendation. Susanna's already said that we were poorly prepared at the beginning, not that it's an explanation, but if we do not support the private sector, we will be poorly prepared again in a few months' time. When back in October, when the government decided that we were going to go from PCR to lateral flow tests, we were all quite vocal. A number of the companies say we do need PCR tests for genome sequencing to influence vaccine strategy, that we know that the virus is mutating. We were very vocal about this, the scientists. And yet when we met DHSC in December and we had Omicron, they said, well, we couldn't have foreseen this happening. Well, we wrote to you. We could see, everybody could foresee this happening. So the concern for me is the removal of PCR tests, but then also who is going to do this? Because the only people that are going to be left standing are those profiteering companies that have made so much money that they can sit out and wait for the next wave of the pandemic. For those companies that haven't grossly overpriced, we will have to let staff go, which is really unfortunate. So for me, we need support from the government to keep those labs that are UCAS accredited, the ones that have got steady, consistent prices. We need support now, otherwise we won't be here for the next wave.
That's really helpful and important. And Tom, did you have a different comment to that or something to add?
No, except, I mean, is there some way you've got a surge capacity? Can one of the learning points for the Department for Transport, for example, can they find a way, what is the ABC of putting this all back in place within 24 hours? What challenge can they give to the sector? If it was me, I'd be worrying about where we can surge again. And I'd want to be auditing what is being lost from the sector that is prohibiting us from being able to do that.
Yeah, it strikes me it's almost like the TAs really. having them on standby going forwards, and how one's going to do that. But also, can I just ask you for one sentence or so on the business about how the labs were commissioned in the first place, both of you, perhaps Natalie and then Tom.
So we weren't commissioned for any government contracts. All of our PCR testing has been through the private sector. So it's either been paid for through schools or education facilities or from the general public.
Did you apply?
We did, yeah.
Yeah, so sorry, Laura, we covered this ground while you were away.
You did.
So, yeah,
Sorry.
Don't worry. Yeah, but actually, Tom might have a broader perspective.
Well, no, the one thing I will say, just to repeat, I mean, most of our members in the LTIO do not provide, have not been involved in public procurement or have not been awarded public contracts. They provide a private support. However, one thing I will say is that one of the things they're very proud of, and rightly so, is there are sectors of the economy that they've kept running throughout the pandemic. So if you look at film and television, we have members that, you're on a film set, you've got 200 technicians, actors, actresses that, stay within a COVID-free bubble. They found the model, the rules you deploy to keep that group of people safe so that they could keep film production. So you wouldn't have Bridgerton, you wouldn't have some of the great productions that have been made in the UK as a result of the sector doing that. And actually, one of the other learning points is, if you look at the research, nearly 4 in 10 workers say they're frightened or very frightened to return to the workplace because they're worried about getting COVID. Yeah. So if there's a big return to work effort at the moment, there's a kind of, gentle encouragement stroke, Daily Mail rhetoric around it. If there's a greater obligation placed on workers to return to work, one of the ways I think you can provide more confidence to workers is actually to use the private sector to allow workforces to reassemble before they get back together. And the sector's ready to do that, and they're very proud of the work they've already done in that area.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask one very final question, which we often ask, which is that you've got someone important in the lift with you, perhaps say the chair of the COVID inquiry that is at some point going to start, and you want to recommend what they should look at in that inquiry. What would you say? But you've literally got 30 seconds. Can I start, please, with Tom?
I think it starts with resourcing of the Civil Contingencies Unit in the Cabinet Office and preparedness for the next pandemic. It's inevitable we're going to have one. Obviously in my previous job, I would have probably hammered this up more, but I mean, there is no doubt that unit suffered from financial cuts from 2010 onwards. What do you need to do to build up a civil contingencies capacity at the very heart of government so that we're more prepared next time round?
Thanks very much. Natalie?
Yeah, I'd agree completely with Tom. I think we need to offer some sort of support to the laboratories that are running these PCR tests. We know we're going to need them in a few months' time. But we can't last any longer. It's the inconsistencies of the business coming in and out. For the majority of us, we're moving into other areas of businesses, or we are letting those short-term staff go. So if the UK hope to be better prepared for the next wave, then we need to support the labs.
Thanks very much. And Susanna?
Yeah, I think I would agree with both Tom and Natalie there, and would potentially use my 30 seconds just saying public procurement over and over again, because I think that it really needs to be looked at why this happened, why we didn't have the systems in place, why outstanding recommendations for dealing with things like conflicts of interest in government, why they've not been applied, and then looking at how they unfortunately led to these problems in the pandemic when we faced them.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much all. That was a really riveting 45 minutes. In a funny way, a sharp contrast to the first panel, but actually very poignant because, hearing how some people did just absolutely game the system when there are just so many, including, your organization, Natalie, and the ones you represent, Tom, and of course, those in our first panel, just trying to follow the rules and do the right thing. That contrast is incredibly sharp, and we wanted to draw that out. I think we've done that very successfully with your help today. So thank you all for your time. Thank you, as ever, to the parliamentarians, to anyone who's watching at home. And thank you to everyone who also submitted evidence. We had a big call to evidence for this one, and we're absolutely inundated. So thank you. If you sent it in, we looked at it and taken into account, and it will inform the report that we'll write off the back of it. So just left for me to say thanks again, and stay safe, everyone. Take care, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.